be abandoned for the concept of enmeshment? I readily acknowledge that this idea itself needs to be more fully developed in light of its therapeutic and clinical usages, but I'm partly drawn to it because of those reasons. Enmeshment entails the development of a scapegoat and implies or parallels the difficulties of a double bind. Adam is given a double bind in the form of dominion, where he is expected to both act as steward and simultaneously subdue creation. A double bind is when you're given a choice where doing one necessarily means you fail in the other, and so you have a double bind when you have two choices, and no matter what you choose, you're wrong. Right? So Adam's double bind is being made steward over a creation he's supposed to subdue, where we don't understand subduing as like caring. Right? At least that's how I'm going to read it for the moment. Okay, so given this double bind that Adam is in, where one fails in one thing by doing the other, it may be the case that the solution to the existential crisis lies in the complete rejection of Western culture, especially a Western culture that's been built upon or around the principles of a double bind. Moving beyond entanglement in favor of enmeshment means updating an analogy we use in our discussion of strangers, that of the knitting knot. To be entangled is to be wrapped up with other beings in such a way that undoing one knot or several undoes the sweater. That was our example from last 2 weeks ago. To be enmeshed is different precisely because we are no longer thinking of being knotted together, but rather imagine our being as the image on the sweater that is the product of the weaving. There is no way to remove the image without destroying the sweater, and more importantly, destroying the fabric in a way that undoing knots does not quite capture. Enmeshment moves us closer to the idea of why this may be if we again consider the existential crisis of Adam. Adam's underlying fear is that having been made in God's image, he is actually just another animal and not at all divine. Greek culture, too, delves into the enmeshment of the human and the animal. Several monsters stand out at this time, and like the Gorgon Medusa, blend the divine, the human, and the animal in an enmeshed and not entangled sort of way. The monsters that exist in Greek culture are not put together in the same way that Dr. Moreau's monsters are. Right? And if you're familiar with Dr. Moreau, right, he takes animals, chops them up, connects them in different ways, and builds his own little vivisected Frankenstein menagerie. Right? But those aren't properly enmeshed. Those are entangled. Right? An enmeshed being is different. The monsters that I'm interested in here are those that present themselves as being more like us than their animal counterparts, but are also amalgamations of the human-animal form and still are recognizably human. Monstrosity in this form takes the shape of minotaurs and centaurs and satyrs and mermaids. However, it also takes the shape of manticores, chimeras, Pegasus, and even Cyclops. And and remember that Cyclops in the Odyssey treats his human captives as livestock alongside of his sheep and even eats them. Right? So these beings exist as materially integrated, but ontologically and metaphysically ambiguous. What is the fear, besides Adam's anthropocentric speciesism, that brings these beings into existence? I'm going to argue that it's a fear whose taproot is buried deep in the anxiety of domination and subsequently alienation. Alienation is traditionally thought to be the separation of humankind from humanness. Marx describes alienation as those capitalistic forces that drive us away from our species being. Existentialists of the 20th century will use notions of angst or alienation to develop a theory of radical freedom in a meaningless world. Theologians working in the Judeo-Christian existentialist tradition will argue, parallel to Marx, interestingly enough, that there is alienation in our lives that derives from our betrayal of God and our subsequent expulsion from Eden. All three of these traditions are kind of correct in their own way, but all three fail to pick out the correct origin point of alienation. and the result is a messy engagement with epistemic and ontological interpretations of human nature and ultimately human being. This type of engagement develops out of having misidentified the origin point of alienation precisely because the misidentification acts as a red herring for the solution to the problem. Let's pause here just for a moment, make sure we're on the same page, and take a closer look at the different types of alienation and how they function in our lives. I'll do this fairly briefly. For Marx, we are alienated through the material development of human society, culminating in capitalism, in the form of alienation from the products that we make, the labor that is exploited, other persons, and ultimately ourselves. Those are the four levels of Marxist alienation. Communism, on the Marxist model, solves for these issues and allows us to reconnect to our species being. This is an idea that will emerge in existential philosophy as authenticity. But Marx is notoriously off the mark in his understanding of nature and especially our ethical obligations to the natural world. Perhaps more fairly, I should argue that it takes an incredible amount of work and a close reading of the entire body of Marx's work to produce Marxist environmental ethics, something that we also addressed the last semester. This matters to our discussion because if we are trying to cultivate a relationship to the world as being, we cannot just mean other people or even other humans. Which is to say, following Marx's philosophy to a post-capitalist society would not necessarily solve our environmental crises. There is no point in doing this work if we will be happily communistic in our socio-political lives and still die because we didn't figure out how to save the world through a proper eco-communalism. Existentialists working in the late 19th and 20th centuries will use alienation in different ways depending on the system that's being developed. And I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to snapshot a couple that are relevant. But you have existentialism that develops in Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, de Beauvoir, Arendt, a number of people like Karl Barth and Paul Tillich. There's a ton of existentialists, right? And the reason for that is, one, because they're all readers of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, who first developed these ideas, though not under the idea of existentialism. These thematic lenses of violence and death and destruction that saturated the early generations of the 20th century allow us to understand a contemporary existential crisis. But they've got it wrong. Kierkegaard draws upon the themes of boredom, anxiety, and absurdity to motivate his existential claims. But consider the context for these considerations. Here I'm going to quote Kierkegaard. What I really lack is to be clear in my mind what I am to do, not what I am to know, except insofar as a kind of understanding must precede every action. Boredom, for Kierkegaard, is the great motivator. Anxiety is the anchor of freedom. And absurdity is the root of faith. Consider the sacrifice of Isaac, right? God tells Abraham, kill your son, prove you love me. And Abraham says, yep, sure, if that's what you want, I'll do it, right? We read that and think it's a crazy person. But for Kierkegaard, he reads that as someone who doesn't need to know, he just needs to do. And so he's been given a command, and through his faith, he will carry it out. And so this is how Kierkegaard is going to read the attempted sacrifice of Isaac. Parallel this to Kierkegaard's exposition of anxiety. Here again, Kierkegaard. If a human being were a beast or an angel, then he could not be anxious. Since he is a synthesis, he can be anxious. And indeed, the deeper the anxiety, the greater the man. Yet not in the sense usually understood, in which anxiety is about something external, about something outside the person, but in the sense that he himself produces that anxiety. Heidegger will develop this theme of authenticity and aims to describe the existential crisis of thrownness, which all beings must confront, that you're just delivered into the world without your own input. Heidegger argues, it is true that existentially the authenticity of being a self is closed off and repressed as entanglement. But this closing off is just a privation of the phenomenological understanding of Dasein as a flight from itself. But why are we in a flight from ourselves? Interestingly, because what drives us to flight is fear. For Heidegger, the only threat which can be fearsome and which is discovered in fear always comes from inner worldly beings. So Heidegger's position is that what causes us to run from our true self is essentially the creation of monsters that we have to manage our fear. Right? Sartre will draw on Heideggerian themes and develop the fixed points in existential philosophy as we know them today. Themes like abandonment, anxiety, bad faith, and absurdity. Sartre will argue that man is condemned to be free, and man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. Consider this existential premise advanced by Sartre. And here's Sartre in a direct quotation. If man as the existentialist sees him is not definable, it is because to begin with he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. Thus there is no human nature, because there is no God to have a conception of it. Man simply is. And if you look at all these themes in Kierkegaard and Heidegger and Sartre, you're seeing the story of Adam, creation from nothing, thrown into the world, right? A being that is condemned to be free. Think about what that means. Adam was put into a world and told that there is a condition upon which if you make a choice, you'll be punished. But Adam wasn't given the intellectual tools to know that choice was wrong until after he made it. So Adam was condemned to be free, and through his freedom, condemned himself. Right? And so then again, we can talk about God as a potentially fallible creator, like one who makes an imperfect world and then bestows upon it an impossible choice. That's problematic. One last person who will be relevant to our discussion of creatures. Camus will interrogate the question of whether or not life is worth living. Situating this question in the context of suicide, anxiety, and absurdity, searching for meaning becomes a question or a search for a reason to live. It is worth mentioning that Camus acknowledges the intensity with which a landscape or nature generally can negate us. And what he means is sometimes you just experience the world in such a way that you feel incredibly small, or your life seems pointless in the grand scheme of things, right? And he thinks you can encounter this in just everyday life. He has a rumination on wishing he was tree roots because they know what they're supposed to do, and there's no sort of like problem like a tree being a tree, but being a human sucks. Right? And so he has this idea of nature as negation of the human.